In Detroit's converted auto garage dojo, a quiet young woman was about to face her tormentor. What began as routine martial arts training turned deadly when Coach Frank DeSoto escalated his harassment campaign. Ayaka Seagal wasn't your typical struggling student. For 15 years, she was trained by legendary martial artist Steven Seagal himself, known for perfecting the most devastating combat techniques in cinema history. When Frank DeSoto grabbed her wrist with brutal intent, he had no idea he was facing a master in disguise. Ayaka unleashed precision that would trigger a reckoning 14 seconds in the making. What began as hidden identity training would become a viral sensation. The Detroit martial arts community would never be the same after father and daughter united to destroy a predator's empire. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Detroit wind cut through the converted auto garage like a blade through flesh. Snow swirled past cracked windows while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across fraying mats that had seen too many years of punishment. The Iron Fist Dojo reeked of sweat and ambition, its walls lined with faded tournament photos and motivational posters that couldn't quite mask the decay beneath. Ayaka Seagal pulled her hood lower as she stepped through the entrance, her breath visible in the cold air that seeped through gaps in the weathered walls. To everyone here, she was simply Aya, another young woman seeking discipline in Detroit's forgotten corners. Her dark eyes swept the space, cataloging exits and assessing the dozens students moving through forms under the watchful gaze of their instructor. Coach Frank DeSoto commanded the center of the room like a king surveying his domain. Thick-necked and barrel-chested, his voice boomed across the mats as he corrected stances with theatrical authority. His graying hair was slicked back, and his GI bore the kind of precise creases that spoke of obsessive control. When his eyes found Aya, they lingered with predatory calculation. "New meet," he announced, causing several students to pause mid-form. "You here for the cardio kickboxing class, sweetheart? That's Tuesdays and Thursdays." Aya's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "I'm here for martial arts training." Frank's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Real martial arts. Not the McDojo stuff they teach in the suburbs." He circled her slowly, making her feel like prey. "You ever been in a real fight? Ever had your nose broken? Ever tasted your own blood? I've trained before." "Where?" "Some strip mall studio with mirrors and motivational music." Frank's sneer deepened. "This is old school, girl. We don't hold hands and sing Kumbaya here." From the corner of her eye, Ian noticed a lean teenage boy watching the exchange with quiet intensity. Malik Bryant stood apart from the other students, his dark skin glistening with sweat from the warm-up drills. Something in his posture, alert but cautious, told her he'd seen this performance before. "All right then," Frank continued, crossing his arms. "Let's see what you got. Basic stance. Show me your horse." Aya dropped into a horse stance, deliberately letting her form slouch slightly. Her knees drifted inward, her spine curved, her weight shifted forward. She made herself look like every untrained beginner Frank had ever dismissed. Pathetic. Frank kicked at her rear foot, causing her to stumble forward. "Your center of gravity is all wrong. You're leaning like a drunk tourist. This is going to take months to fix." But Malik noticed what Frank didn't. The microsecond of perfect balance before she allowed herself to fall. The controlled way she absorbed the impact. The breath control that never wavered despite the supposed struggle. His eyes narrowed with growing curiosity. The next hour passed in deliberate mediocrity. Aya threw punches that looked wild but stayed perfectly within the lines of believable inexperience. She stumbled through combinations, asked obvious questions, and let Frank's condescension wash over her like rain. Other students began to relax, some even smirking at her apparent helplessness. "Pair up for conditioning drills," Frank barked. "New girl, you're with Martinez." Carlos Martinez was built like a refrigerator with fists, easily outweighing Aya by 60 pounds. His smile was apologetic as they faced each other for light contact sparring, but his eyes held the kind of pity that stung worse than contempt. "Go easy on her," Frank called out with mock concern. "Don't want to break our delicate flower on day one." The drill began simply enough, basic combinations at quarter speed. But Aya caught something in Carlos's rhythm, a tell in his shoulder. Before he threw his right cross, when he accelerated unexpectedly, trying to test her reflexes. She slipped the punch with fluid grace before immediately returning to her clumsy persona. Malik's head turned sharply. He'd been watching peripherally while working with his own partner, and that slip had been too clean, too instinctive. Real fighters moved like that, not beginners who'd learned from YouTube videos. "Time," Frank called, his voice cutting through the heavy air. "New girl, you're gonna need private lessons if you want to survive in here. Extra cost, of course." Aya nodded meekly, playing her part. "How much extra? We can discuss that later. Privately." Frank's smile didn't reach his eyes. "For now, run laps. Condition those soft muscles." As she jogged the perimeter of the dojo, Aya felt the weight of assessment from every angle. Some students watched with bored dismissal, others with mild sympathy. But Malik's gaze was different, searching, suspicious, almost protective. The session ended with Frank's traditional speech about discipline, respect, and the warrior's path. Students bowed, collected their gear, and filtered out into the Detroit cold. Aya lingered, pretending to struggle with her shoes while really observing the dynamics she'd stepped into. "Hey," Malik approached as the dojo emptied. His voice was quiet, careful. "You okay?" He gets like that with new people sometimes. "I'm fine." Aya shouldered her bag, studying his face. Something in his eyes suggested he saw more than he was saying. "I'm Malik." He extended a fist for a bump rather than a handshake. "Been training here 2 years. If you need any tips or whatever." "Aya." She returned the gesture, noting the calluses on his knuckles, the slight asymmetry in his left shoulder that spoke of old injuries poorly healed. "Thanks." As they walked toward the exit together, neither spoke about what they'd really observed. But something had shifted in the dojo's ecosystem, a new variable introduced into Frank's carefully controlled environment. Outside, snow continued to fall on Detroit's broken streets, and in the distance, a figure in a long coat watched from the shadow of a nearby building, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The second week brought no mercy. Frank DeSoto prowled the mats like a predator who'd caught a scent, his attention laser-focused on breaking down the new girl who dared to occupy space in his domain. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher, the air thicker with tension that even the other students couldn't ignore. "Aya." Frank's voice cracked like a whip across the training floor. "Front and center. Time to see if you learned anything from last week's embarrassment." She moved forward with the same deliberate awkwardness she'd cultivated, but now Frank's eyes tracked every step with suspicious intensity. The other students formed a loose circle, some hungry for entertainment, others uncomfortable with the obvious targeting. "You're gonna spar Williams today," Frank announced, gesturing to a compact but powerful student whose neck was nearly as wide as his head. "Tommy here's got a fight coming up. Needs to practice against different body types." Tommy Williams looked apologetic but determined. At 5'10" and probably 200 pounds of muscle, he represented everything Frank wanted to test against Aya's slight frame. His hands were wrapped with the kind of precision that spoke of serious training, and old scar tissue above his left eyebrow told stories of violence endured and survived. Like contact, Frank continued with theatrical concern. "Wouldn't want to damage our precious princess before she's had a chance to quit." Malik shifted uncomfortably near the edge of the circle. Over the past week, he'd caught more glimpses of the real person beneath Aya's carefully constructed facade. The way she moved when she thought no one was watching, the perfect balance when retrieving dropped water bottles, the controlled breathing that never quite matched her supposed exhaustion. "Coach," Malik spoke up, his voice cutting through the heavy air. "Maybe she should spar someone closer to her size first." Frank's head turned slowly, his smile predatory. "You volunteering to babysit Bryant? Think she needs a protector?" "I just think, you think." Frank stepped closer to Malik, using his bulk to intimidate. "You think you know better than me how to run my dojo? You think you understand training better than someone who's been doing this since before you were born?" The room fell silent, except for the buzz of dying fluorescent lights. Other students studied their shoes, unwilling to draw Frank's fire. But something in Malik's posture remained unbowed, even as his hands trembled slightly at his sides. "No, sir," Malik said quietly. "I don't think that." "Good. Then shut up and watch how we separate the wheat from the chaff." Frank turned back to the center of the circle, where Aya stood in a deliberately sloppy fighting stance. Her guard was too low, her feet too wide, her chin too high. Every amateur mistake cataloged and displayed. "Begin," Frank commanded. Tommy moved forward with respectful caution, throwing lazy jabs that Aya could easily avoid even while maintaining her clumsy persona. But Frank wasn't satisfied with the gentle pace. "What is this ballroom dancing?" he barked. "Williams, show her what real pressure feels like. Stop being delicate." Tommy's expression shifted apologetically, but he followed orders. His next combination came harder, faster, a right cross followed by a left hook that carried real intent. Aya slipped both punches with movements so fluid they seemed liquid, then immediately stumbled backward as if the evasion had been accidental. Frank's eyes narrowed. That slip had been too clean, too instinctive. Again, he commanded. "And Williams, commit to your punches. She needs to understand what she's getting into." The sparring resumed with increased intensity. Tommy pressed forward with combinations that would have overwhelmed most beginners, but Aya continued her dance of controlled incompetence. She absorbed some shots on her forearms with perfect blocking technique disguised as panicked flailing, slipped others with movements that looked like lucky stumbles, and even managed a counterpunch that appeared wild but landed exactly where it would do the most good. Malik watched in growing amazement. Every mistake was perfectly executed. Every defensive movement disguised as accident or desperation. She was playing Frank like a master musician playing a simple song, all the skill hidden beneath apparent simplicity. But Frank was beginning to see through the performance. His jaw tightened as he watched Aya accidentally pivot away from a takedown attempt with footwork that would have impressed a professional fighter. "Enough," he called, stepping into the circle. "I think our little princess needs some personal attention." The other students backed away instinctively as Frank approached Aya, his bulk casting a shadow across the mats. Up close, the size difference was even more dramatic, Frank's thick chest and shoulders dwarfing her compact frame. "You know," he said conversationally, "I've been teaching for 15 years. I can usually spot natural talent, even in beginners." His hand reached out ostensibly to adjust her stance, fingers gripping her wrist with more pressure than necessary. "But you're interesting. Sometimes you move like you know what you're doing. Then suddenly you're stumbling like a drunk teenager." Aya's pulse quickened, but her expression remained neutral. "I'm just trying to learn." "Are you?" Frank's grip tightened, his thumb pressing against the pulse point in her wrist. "Because it almost looks like you're holding back. Like you're not showing us everything you can do." The room held its breath. Several students shifted uncomfortably, sensing the predatory edge in their instructor's voice. Malik's hands clenched into fists at his sides, every instinct screaming at him to intervene. "I don't know what you mean," Aya said quietly, meeting Frank's gaze without flinching. "Let me be more direct." Frank's other hand moved to her shoulder, ostensibly demonstrating proper positioning, but actually establishing physical dominance. "In my dojo, we don't play games. We don't hide. If you've got skills, you show them. If you don't, you get honest about your limitations." His fingers dug into her shoulder, right at the pressure point where the trapezius muscle met the neck. Pain shot through her system, but Aya's expression barely flickered. "Coach," Malik's voice cut through the tension. "That looks like it hurts." Frank's head turned slowly, his smile cold and dangerous. "Bryant, one more word out of you, and you're running suicide sprints until you puke. This is instruction, not abuse." But even as he said it, his grip on Aya's shoulder increased, fingers pressing deeper into the nerve cluster. The other students watched in uncomfortable silence, some looking away, others staring with the horrified fascination of witnesses to a car accident. Aya remained perfectly still, her breathing controlled, her expression calm despite the pain radiating through her shoulder and down her arm. This was Frank's test, to see if she would break character, if she would reveal her true capabilities in response to his escalating pressure. She chose restraint. "I understand," she said simply, not pulling away from his grip, but not submitting to it either. Frank held the position for several more seconds, his eyes searching her face for cracks in the facade. When he found none, he released her with apparent disappointment. "Good," he said, but his tone suggested anything but satisfaction. "Tomorrow we'll work on your conditioning. Real conditioning. The kind that separates pretenders from fighters." As the class ended and students began filtering out, Malik lingered near the equipment rack, pretending to organize hand wraps while keeping an eye on Aya. She moved with the same carefully constructed awkwardness, but he caught the slight rotation of her shoulder as she tested for damage, the way her fingers briefly probed the pressure points Frank had targeted. Outside in the parking lot, snow crunched under their feet as Malik caught up with her. "He's getting worse," he said quietly, glancing back at the dojo to make sure they weren't overheard. "I can handle it." "Can you?" Malik stopped walking, forcing her to turn and face him. Because that wasn't instruction in there. That was something else. Aya studied his face in the dim light cast by a nearby street lamp. Something in his eyes, concern mixed with determination, reminded her of someone else, though she couldn't quite place who. "Why do you train here?" she asked instead of answering his question. Malik was quiet for a long moment, his breath visible in the cold air. "Because it's the only place that would take someone like me. Foster kid with no money and an attitude. Problem." He kicked at a chunk of ice on the sidewalk. "But lately, I'm wondering if it's worth it. What would you do instead?" "I don't know. That's the problem." He looked back at the dojo, its windows glowing yellow in the darkness. This place used to be different. Before Frank started changing. They walked in comfortable silence for another block before parting ways at a bus stop. But as Aya headed home through Detroit's empty streets, she was unaware of the figure following at a distance, staying just far enough back to remain invisible while keeping her safely in sight. In the shadow of a closed storefront, Steven Seagal adjusted his coat collar against the cold wind and continued his silent vigil. The East Side Community Center occupied a converted warehouse 3 miles from the dojo, its brick walls painted in bright murals that depicted hope rising from urban decay. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed over a collection of folding chairs arranged in a circle, where a dozen children aged 8 to 14 sat cross-legged on donated yoga mats. Aya moved between them with natural grace, adjusting stances and offering quiet encouragement as they practiced basic self-defense techniques. Here, away from Frank's toxic scrutiny, her true self emerged, patient, nurturing, technically precise without being intimidating. "Remember," she told a shy 10-year-old named Marcus whose wrists were barely thicker than pencils, "it's not about being strong enough to hurt someone. It's about being smart enough to get away." She demonstrated the technique again, a simple wrist escape that used leverage instead of force. Marcus tried it, his face screwed up in concentration, and managed to break free from her gentle grip on the third attempt. Yes, Aya's smile was genuine, transformative. "See how you used your whole body, not just your arms. That's the secret." From the doorway, Malik watched with growing understanding. He'd followed her here after their second week of training, curiosity finally overcoming his natural respect for privacy. What he saw confirmed his suspicions. This wasn't someone learning martial arts. This was someone who'd been teaching them for years. "Miss Aya," called out Destiny, a precocious 8-year-old whose foster placement had taught her to be wary of adults. "What if they're bigger than you? Like way bigger?" Aya's expression grew thoughtful. "Size matters, but not as much as people think. The most important weapon you have is your brain. Sometimes the best fight is the one you don't have. But what if you can't run away?" The question hung in the air, loaded with the kind of weight that came from lived experience. Aya knelt beside Destiny, meeting her eyes directly. "Then you do whatever it takes to survive," she said quietly. "And you never, ever let anyone make you feel like it's your fault." After the session ended and the children were collected by parents and guardians, Aya sat alone in the empty community center, staring at her reflection in the darkened windows. Malik approached cautiously, like someone approaching a wild animal. "You're not who you pretend to be," he said without preamble. Aya didn't turn around. "None of us are. I mean really not who you pretend to be." Malik sat down beside her, on the folding chair, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You've been trained by someone serious. Like, professionally serious." She was quiet for so long that Malik began to think she wouldn't respond. Then, without looking at him, she spoke. "My father is a martial artist. Traditional training. Started when I was 5. Her voice carried layers of complicated emotion. "He taught me discipline, technique, philosophy. Everything except how to be his daughter. What happened? Nothing dramatic. He just wasn't there. Physically present sometimes, but emotionally. She shrugged. He treated me like a student, not a child. Success was measured in perfect forms and tournament victories, not in bedtime stories or help with homework. Malik processed this, recognizing the particular kind of abandonment that came wrapped in good intentions. Is that why you're hiding? At the dojo, I mean? I don't want to be known as his daughter. I want to be known as me. Aya's hands clenched in her lap. But every time I walk into a martial arts school, every time I show what I can really do, that's all anyone sees. His technique, his legacy, his reputation. Never mind. She pulled out her phone and scrolled to a photo. A younger version of herself, maybe 12, standing beside a tall man in a traditional GI. Even in the picture, there was distance between them, two people sharing space but not connection. I used to worship him, she continued. Thought he was the strongest person in the world. Spent years trying to earn his attention, his approval, his pride. She put the phone away. Took me longer to realize that some people don't know how to love, only how to instruct. Malik understood more than she realized. Foster care had taught him about the different ways adults could fail children, neglect, abuse, or sometimes just the simple inability to see past their own limitations. So why stay at Frank's place? If you don't want to fight, why put yourself through that? Aya's laugh was bitter. Because I do want to fight, just not as my father's daughter. I want to prove that what I've learned, what I've built, belongs to me. She met his eyes. Does that make sense? Yeah, Malik said quietly. It does. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching snow fall past the windows. Finally, Aya spoke again. What about you? What's your story? Malik's smile was wry. Not as complicated as yours. Mom died when I was 10, no dad in the picture, bounced around foster homes until I aged out at 18. The dojo's the first place I ever felt like I belonged somewhere. Even with Frank, he wasn't always like this. When I started, he was strict but fair. Pushed people to be better, not to break them down. Malik's expression darkened. Something changed about 6 months ago. He got meaner, more controlling. Started targeting people, especially women. Has anyone complained? To who? He owns the place, and most of the students are like me, nowhere else to go. Malik's hands clenched. I keep telling myself it'll get better, that maybe he's just going through something. But watching him with you, I can handle Frank. Can you? Because he's not just going to stop. Men like him, they escalate. Malik turned to face her fully. Maybe it's time to stop hiding who you really are. Aya considered this, feeling the weight of a decision she'd been avoiding. And become my father's daughter again? No, Malik said firmly. Become yourself. All of yourself. Outside the community center, snow continued to fall on Detroit's empty streets. In the shadow of a parked car across the street, Steven Seagal watched his daughter through the window, pride and regret warring in his chest. He'd followed her here 3 times now, drawn by reports of her volunteer work and the obvious care she showed for the children. Each time, he saw more of the woman. She'd become strong, compassionate, independent. Everything he'd hoped for and everything he'd failed to nurture. His phone buzzed with a text from an old contact. Your girl's at that dojo in Corktown. Heard the instructors got problems. You keeping an eye on things? Steven studied the message, then looked back at the community center where Aya was helping Malik stack chairs. She moved with unconscious grace, her techniques visible in every gesture despite her civilian clothes. She was ready, had been ready for years. The question was whether he was ready to let her choose her own battles. He deleted the text without responding and melted back into the Detroit night, a shadow protecting another shadow, waiting for the moment when protection wouldn't be enough. The 3rd week arrived with a cold snap that made the dojo's heating system work overtime, filling the converted garage with stifling air that reeked of sweat and desperation. Frank DeSoto moved through his domain with the confidence of a predator who'd identified his prey, his eyes never straying far from Aya. As she went through her carefully orchestrated routine of controlled incompetence. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But something had shifted in the ecosystem. Other students had begun to notice the pattern. How? Frank's attention focused on her with laser intensity. How his instruction carried undertones of something darker. Conversations died when he approached, and more than one student had started avoiding eye contact during his increasingly volatile demonstrations. "Today we're working on close-quarters combat," Frank announced to the assembled class. Real-world scenarios where running away isn't an option. He'd arranged the mats in a demonstration circle, himself at the center like a gladiator awaiting combat. His GI was pristine as always, his black belt tied with the kind of precision that spoke of obsessive control. But there was something different in his posture today, a coiled tension that suggested barely contained violence. "Aya," he called out, his voice carrying across the heavy air. "Center mat. Time to see how you handle pressure when someone's really trying to hurt you." She moved forward with the same deliberate awkwardness she'd cultivated, but Malik caught the slight hesitation in her step. After their conversation at the community center, something had changed between them, an understanding that made the weight of her deception heavier. "The scenario is simple," Frank continued, beginning to circle her like a shark. "You're cornered in an alley. No escape route. Attacker wants to establish dominance." His smile was cold and predatory. "What do? Try to de-escalate," Aya suggested, playing her part. "Wrong answer." Frank stepped closer, using his bulk to loom over her. "De-escalation is what weak people do. Warriors respond with violence." He reached out ostensibly to adjust her stance, but his hands lingered on her shoulders with more familiarity than instruction required. His fingers pressed into the same pressure points he'd targeted the week before, renewing the dull ache that had never quite faded. "See, the problem with most women," Frank continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "is they think they can reason with predators. They think nice words and good intentions will save them." His grip tightened, fingers digging deeper into her shoulders. Around the circle, students shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that they were witnessing something that had crossed the line from instruction into abuse. "Coach," Malik's voice cut through the tension. "She's not fighting back because you told us this was a demonstration, not sparring." Frank's head turned slowly, his eyes cold and dangerous. "Bryant, I don't remember asking for commentary from the peanut gallery. I'm just saying, you're just saying nothing." Frank released Aya abruptly and stepped toward Malik, using his bulk to intimidate. "You got something to prove? Want a white knight for your girlfriend?" "She's not my girlfriend. She's just what? Too delicate for real training?" Frank's voice rose, carrying across the entire dojo. "Too precious to learn what violence actually looks like." The other students watched in uncomfortable silence as Frank closed the distance to Malik, his chest nearly touching the younger man's chin. But something in Malik's posture remained unbowed, even as his hands trembled slightly at his sides. "No, sir," Malik said quietly. "I just think there's a difference between teaching and hurting people." The words hung in the air, like a challenge. Frank's face flushed red, his jaw clenching with barely contained rage. For a moment, the entire dojo held its breath, waiting to see if the verbal confrontation would escalate into something physical. Instead, Frank smiled, a cold, calculating expression that was somehow more frightening than anger. "You think I'm hurting people?" he asked conversationally. "You think I don't know the difference between instruction and abuse?" He turned back to Aya, who had remained motionless in the center of the circle. Without warning, his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, yanking her forward with enough force to make her stumble. "Let me show you what hurt actually looks like," he said, beginning to apply pressure to the small bones in her wrist. "This is a basic pain compliance technique used by law enforcement to control uncooperative subjects." Aya's face remained impassive despite the grinding sensation in her wrist bones. Around the circle, several students looked away, unable to watch what was clearly torture disguised as demonstration. "The beauty of this technique," Frank continued, increasing the pressure incrementally, "is that it leaves no marks, no evidence, just pain that teaches respect." Malik started forward, but Aya caught his eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. She could end this in a dozen different ways: break Frank's grip, reverse the hold, or simply step into him and use his own momentum against him. But doing so would shatter her carefully constructed identity and expose the skills she'd spent weeks hiding. Instead, she made a different choice. "Let go of me," she said quietly, her voice carrying a steel core that hadn't been there during previous encounters. Frank's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "Oh, Now you find your voice? Now you decide to make demands? I said let go. Her tone was flat, emotionless, but something in it made Frank hesitate. For just a moment, his grip loosened fractionally, not enough to free her, but enough to suggest uncertainty. Or what? He challenged, but there was less conviction in his voice now. Aya met his eyes directly, and for the first time since entering the dojo, she allowed him to see a glimpse of what lay beneath her carefully constructed facade. Not the helpless beginner he'd been tormenting, but someone who had spent years learning exactly how to hurt people who needed hurting. Or I'll make you, she said simply. The words were spoken quietly, without heat or anger, but they carried absolute conviction. Around the circle, students held their breath as they witnessed something shift in the power dynamic that had defined their training space for months. Frank stared into her eyes, searching for the weakness he'd grown accustomed to exploiting. Instead, he found something that made his grip falter, not fear, but patience. The kind of patience that came from absolute confidence in one's ability to end a threat whenever necessary. He released her wrist abruptly, stepping back with forced laughter. Well, looks like our little mouse might have some teeth after all. But even as he tried to reclaim control through mockery, something fundamental had changed. The other students had seen him back down, had witnessed the moment when his victim became something else entirely. Class dismissed, Frank announced, his voice carrying less authority than usual. Practice your forms at home. We'll continue this lesson next week. As students began filing out, gathering their gear with unusual haste, Malik lingered near the equipment rack. He watched Aya test her wrist carefully, rotating it to assess for damage, and saw the clinical precision with which she evaluated her injury. That wasn't the first time, he said quietly once they were alone. No, Aya agreed. It won't be the last. So what do we do? She looked at him for a long moment, seeing the determination in his young face, the willingness to stand up despite the cost. It reminded her of someone, herself, perhaps, at an age when the world still seemed like something that could be fixed through pure will and good intentions. We wait, she said finally, and we get ready. Outside, snow continued to fall on Detroit's broken streets. In the shadow of a building across from the dojo, Steven Seagal watched through the window as his daughter massaged feeling back into her wrist. His hands clenched at his sides, every instinct screaming at him to walk through that door and end Frank DeSoto's reign of terror in approximately 14 seconds. But he forced himself to remain still, to trust in the strength he'd helped build, but never properly nurtured. She wasn't his little girl anymore. She was a warrior in her own right, fighting a battle he couldn't win for her. Still, he pulled out his phone and sent a single text to an old contact. Keep that location under surveillance. Things are about to get interesting. Then he melted back into the Detroit night, a shadow preparing for the moment when watching would no longer be enough. The sound of the dojo's heavy door slamming against the wall made every head turn. Nina Torres stood in the entrance like an avenging angel, her dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, her eyes scanning the room with the intensity of someone who'd seen too much and decided to do something about it. At 19, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd survived worse than anything this place could offer. Frank DeSoto's face went pale, then flushed red as recognition dawned. Well, look what the cat dragged in. Hello, Frank. Nina's voice carried the kind of casual menace that comes from no longer giving a damn about consequences. Heard you were up to your old tricks again. The training session ground to a halt as students pretended to adjust their gear while actually watching the confrontation unfold. Nina had been a legend at the dojo, the girl who'd stood up to Frank's increasingly volatile behavior before disappearing one night without explanation. Her return carried the weight of unfinished business. Aya watched from the corner where she'd been practicing forms, recognizing something in Nina's posture that spoke of hard-won wisdom. This wasn't someone playing a role or hiding behind false personas. This was someone who'd found her voice and decided to use it. You're not welcome here anymore, Torres, Frank said, trying to project authority but unable to hide the slight tremor in his voice. You made your choice when you walked out. I didn't walk out, Nina corrected, stepping further into the room. I ran, because I was 17 and scared and didn't know any better. Her smile was sharp as a blade. But I'm not 17 anymore. She moved through the room with predatory grace, cataloging the faces of students she recognized and noting the new ones. When her eyes found Aya, they lingered with obvious assessment. "So this is the fresh meat you've been tenderizing," Nina said, approaching Aya with deliberate casualness. "I'm Nina, former student, current pain in Frank's ass." "Aya," she replied, maintaining her carefully constructed persona while studying Nina's face for tells. Something in the older girl's eyes suggested she saw more than most people. "Nina," Frank's voice cracked like a whip across the room. "You've got 5 minutes to say whatever you came to say, then you're gone." 5 minutes. Nina laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement. "Frank, you always were optimistic about your ability to control women." She turned to address the assembled students, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "How many of you have seen Frank get a little too hands-on during training? A little too aggressive with the female students?" Uncomfortable silence stretched across the mats. Students exchanged glances, but nobody spoke. The culture of fear and intimidation Frank had cultivated keeping them frozen. "Nobody." Nina's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "That's interesting, because when I was here, he had a real problem keeping his hands to himself, especially during private lessons." "That's enough," Frank snarled, starting toward her with obvious intent to physically remove her from the premises. "Is it?" Nina stood her ground, showing no fear of his approaching bulk. "Because from what I hear, nothing's changed. If anything, it's gotten worse." Malik stepped forward from the crowd, his young face set with determination. "She's right," he said quietly. "You've been targeting people, Frank, making training about domination instead of discipline." Frank's head snapped toward him, eyes blazing with fury. "Bryant, you're done here. Pack your gear and get out." "No." The word came from Aya, spoken quietly but with absolute conviction. "You don't get to silence people for telling the truth." Nina's eyes sharpened as she studied Aya's stance, the way she held herself despite maintaining her facade of inexperience. Something clicked into place, recognition of skill hidden beneath careful misdirection. "Interesting," Nina murmured, approaching Aya with obvious intent. "You know what, Aya? You remind me of someone. Can't quite put my finger on who, though." She circled Aya slowly, her assessment obvious and deliberate. "The way you move, the way you breathe, even the way you're standing right now." She paused directly in front of her. "That's not amateur body language." Frank sensed the shift in dynamics, the way his carefully constructed narrative was beginning to unravel. "Torres, you're out of line. These are serious accusations." "Are they accusations if they're true?" Nina interrupted, never taking her eyes off Aya. "And judging by the look on your face, they're definitely true." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small digital recorder, holding it up for everyone to see. "Funny thing about living in the digital age, everything gets recorded eventually." Frank's face went ashen. "You recorded private conversations?" "I recorded evidence of harassment, intimidation, and assault," Nina corrected. "Conversations where you bragged about your methods for breaking down difficult students, particularly the female ones who needed to be taught their place." The room erupted in whispers as students processed this revelation. Some looked shocked, others relieved that someone had finally said what they'd all been thinking. That's illegal," Frank stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. "So is what you've been doing," Nina replied smoothly. "Want to compare notes with the police?" Aya watched the exchange with growing admiration for Nina's tactical brilliance. This wasn't just confrontation, it was systematic dismantling of a predator's power structure. But she also recognized the danger in the situation. Cornered animals were often at their most vicious. "I think we should all take a step back," Aya said carefully, trying to de-escalate before violence erupted. Nina's smile was knowing. "Always the peacemaker, aren't you?" "Very diplomatic." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But sometimes peace isn't what predators understand." There was something in Nina's tone that suggested she knew more about Aya's background than she was letting on. A recognition that went beyond casual observation. "You want to know what I think?" Nina continued, still speaking quietly enough that only Aya could hear. "I think you're tired of hiding. I think you're ready to stop pretending to be helpless when you're anything but." Before Aya could respond, Frank's voice boomed across the room. "Everyone out. Training's over for today." But nobody moved. The dynamic had shifted too dramatically, the illusion of his absolute authority shattered by Nina's calculated assault on his credibility. Actually, Nina said, raising her voice to address the room, I think training's just getting started. The real kind, where students learn to defend themselves instead of learning to submit. She pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. I'm posting this recording on every social media platform I can think of. Let's see how the community feels about Frank's teaching methods. As she spoke, Aya made a decision that would change everything. She stepped forward, her posture subtly shifting from the hunched, defensive stance she'd maintained for weeks to something more upright, more confident. Nina, she said, her voice carrying a new authority. Before you do that, there's something you should know about me. Nina's fingers paused over her phone screen, her eyes locking onto Aya's face. What's that? Aya took a deep breath, feeling the weight of weeks of deception lifting from her shoulders. My real name isn't Aya. It's Ayaka. Ayaka Seagal. The silence that followed was deafening. Every student in the room stared at her with shock, recognition, and sudden understanding. Frank's face went through several shades of pale before settling. On a sickly green, Nina's smile was triumphant. Now that, she said, changes everything. Outside in the Detroit cold, Steven Seagal's phone buzzed with an alert from the surveillance team he'd positioned around the dojo. The text was simple. She just revealed her identity. Things are about to get very interesting. He closed his eyes, feeling pride and terror war in his chest. His daughter had made her choice. Now all he could do was be ready for whatever came next. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be contained. Ayaka Seagal, not Aya, not some random girl seeking martial arts training, but the daughter of a legend, stood in the center of Frank DeSoto's crumbling empire, her true identity finally exposed. Frank's face cycled through emotions like a slot machine: shock, disbelief, calculating greed, and finally, predatory hunger. Steven Seagal's daughter, he breathed, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and avarice. No wonder you moved like you had training. The other students backed away instinctively, sensing that whatever was about to happen would be violent and permanent. Only Malik remained close, his protective instincts overriding his survival impulses. All this time, Frank continued, beginning to circle her like a predator who'd found wounded prey. You've been playing games with me, making me look like a fool in front of my students. I wasn't playing games, Ayaka replied, her voice steady. Despite the charged atmosphere, I was trying to learn without the baggage of my name. Learn. Frank's laugh was ugly, bitter. You already know more than half the people in this room. You've been slumming, princess, having a little fun watching the poor kid struggle. Nina stepped forward, recognizing the dangerous shift in Frank's demeanor. Back off, Frank. This doesn't change anything about what you've been doing, doesn't it? Frank's eyes gleamed with malicious calculation. Because I'm thinking, miss. Seagal here owes me some compensation for wasting my time, for lying to me and my students. He moved closer to Ayaka, his bulk casting a shadow across the mats. See, training the daughter of Steven Seagal? That's worth something. That's the kind of publicity that could transform this place. I'm not my father's publicity tool, Ayaka said firmly. No, but you're going to be mine. Frank's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with bruising force. We're going to have a little demonstration. Show everyone what real Seagal training looks like. The grip was different this time, not the careful pressure of previous encounters, but genuine violence. Frank's fingers dug into her wrist bones with the intent to cause damage, to break something that would serve as a permanent reminder of his power. Let her go, Malik said, stepping forward despite the obvious size difference. Frank's head turned slowly, his smile cold and predatory. Or what, Bryant? You going to fight me? You going to protect your little girlfriend? She's not. Frank's free hand lashed out, catching Malik across the face with an open palm strike that sent him stumbling backward. The sound echoed across the silent dojo like a gunshot. Stay down, Frank snarled, still maintaining his grip on Ayaka's wrist. This is between me and the princess here. But Malik didn't stay down. Blood trickled from his split lip as he regained his footing, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. I said let her go. You really want to do this? Frank released Ayaka abruptly and turned his full attention to Malik. You want to try me, boy? The two males faced each other. Across the mats, Frank with his bulk and years of bitter experience, Malik with his youth and desperate courage. It was David and Goliath, except David had forgotten to bring his sling. Frank moved first, a straight right hand that should have ended the confrontation immediately. But Malik had spent 2 years learning from the best teacher he'd ever had, pain. He slipped the punch with desperate grace and landed a solid counter to Frank's ribs. The older man grunted, more surprised than hurt, and responded with a combination that caught Malik in the solar plexus. The teenager doubled over, gasping for air, but still didn't go down. Enough, Ayaka said, her voice cutting through the violence like a blade. Both men paused, breathing hard, staring at her with different expressions, Frank with renewed predatory interest, Malik with desperate hope. I said enough. Ayaka stepped between them, her posture no longer that of a confused beginner, but of someone who'd spent years learning to end conflicts efficiently. This stops now. Frank's laugh was ugly. Oh, now you want to play hero? Now you want to show off daddy's training? He grabbed for her again, but this time Ayaka was ready. Her response was so fast, so economical, that most of the watching students missed it entirely. One moment Frank was reaching for her. The next he was on his knees, his wrist trapped in a lock that had him gasping in pain. I don't want to hurt you, Ayaka said quietly, maintaining just enough pressure to keep him immobilized. But I will if you make me. The technique was perfect, a classic Aikido wrist lock that used Frank's own momentum against him. But more than that, it was controlled, precise, and utterly confident. This wasn't lucky desperation or beginner's accident. This was mastery. Frank struggled against the hold, his face flushing red with effort and humiliation. You think this changes anything? You think showing off makes you special? No, Ayaka replied, increasing the pressure just enough to stop his struggles. But it makes me tired of pretending to be weak. She held the lock for several more seconds, letting Frank feel the reality of his position, then released him and stepped back. He remained on his knees, cradling his wrist and staring at her with a mixture of fury and fear. Class dismissed, she said, her voice carrying absolute authority. The students began filing out quickly, eager to escape before the situation escalated further. But Malik lingered, wiping blood from his split lip and watching Ayaka with obvious admiration. That was incredible, he said once they were alone with Frank, who was still kneeling on the mat. It was necessary, Ayaka corrected, helping him examine his injuries. Are you okay? I've been better. Malik's smile was rueful despite the pain. But I've also been worse. Nina approached them, her phone still recording everything. Well, that was educational. Frank, I hope you enjoyed your little power trip, because it's about to cost you everything. Frank climbed slowly to his feet, his face a mask of barely contained rage. This isn't over, he said, his voice rough with humiliation. Yes, it is, Ayaka replied firmly. It's over because I'm done hiding. I'm done pretending to be something I'm not to spare your ego. She turned to address the few remaining students. Anyone who wants real training, who wants to learn discipline instead of domination, can find me at the East Side Community Center. We start tomorrow. As they gathered their gear to leave, Frank's voice followed them. You think you've won something? You think this matters? Ayaka paused at the door, looking back at the man who'd tormented her and others for months. I think it matters to every person you've hurt, and I think it's going to matter to you when the police show up. Outside in the Detroit cold, the three of them walked in silence for several blocks before Malik spoke. So what happens now? Now we build something better, Ayaka replied. Something clean. Nina nodded, still recording everything on her phone. And we make sure Frank never gets the chance to hurt anyone else. As they parted ways at the bus stop, none of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows across the street. Steven Seagal adjusted his coat collar against the wind, pride and concern warring in his chest. His daughter had found her voice, her strength, her identity. But he also knew that cornered predators were often at their most dangerous. And Frank DeSoto had just been backed into a corner with nothing left to lose. The real test was still coming. 3 days later, the Iron Fist Dojo was packed tighter than it had been in months. Word had spread through Detroit's martial arts community like wildfire. Steven Seagal's daughter was training at Frank DeSoto's place, and Frank was planning some kind of demonstration to set the record straight. Parents lined the walls, some there to support their children, others drawn by morbid curiosity. Local media had gotten wind of the story, and two news crews set up cameras in the back corner. The air was electric with anticipation and barely contained tension. Frank DeSoto stood at the center of the mats, his GI pristine and his black belt tied with obsessive precision. But his eyes held a wild gleam that spoke of a man who'd spent 3 sleepless nights planning his revenge. Nina's recordings had gone viral, his reputation was in shambles, and half his students had already transferred to other schools. This was his last chance to salvage something from the wreckage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying across the packed room. "Tonight we're going to settle some misconceptions about martial arts training, about discipline, respect, and what it really means to be a warrior." Ayaka entered through the side door, moving with the quiet confidence she no longer bothered to hide. She wore a simple white GI without rank, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Malik and Nina flanked her like bodyguards, their faces tense with anticipation. "Ayaka Seagal," Frank continued, his voice dripping with false cordiality, "has been training here under false pretenses, hiding her identity, pretending to be a beginner while possessing advanced skills. Tonight, we're going to see what she's really capable of." He gestured grandly toward the center of the mats. A friendly demonstration. Student versus instructor. No hard feelings, just honest martial arts. Ayaka stepped forward, recognizing the trap, but unable to avoid it without appearing cowardly. The crowd pressed closer, phones raised to record whatever was about to happen. "I appreciate the invitation," she said quietly, "but I think we've already established our respective positions." "Have we?" Frank's smile was predatory. "Because from where I stand, you sucker punched me when I wasn't ready. That's not martial arts, that's cheap shots." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some parents nodded agreement, while others looked uncomfortable with the obvious setup. In the back corner, news cameras rolled, capturing every word for the evening broadcast. "Fine," Ayaka said, bowing formally before stepping onto the demonstration mat. "If you insist on doing this, let's do it properly." Frank's grin widened as he returned the bow, but his eyes never left her face. "Finally, some honesty. Let's see what Daddy really taught you." They circled each other warily, Frank using his size advantage to try to intimidate, while Ayaka remained centered and calm. The crowd held its collective breath, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. Frank attacked without warning, a brutal overhand right that carried all his weight and fury. It was meant to end the fight immediately, to crush any pretense of skill Ayaka might possess. She wasn't there when the punch landed. Her movement was so fluid, so perfectly timed, that Frank's momentum carried him past her entirely. Before he could recover, her elbow found the nerve cluster in his shoulder, temporarily paralyzing his right arm. "Stop," she said quietly, stepping back to give him space to recover. But Frank was beyond reason now, his humiliation complete and his rage consuming. He spun around with a wild haymaker from his left hand, putting everything he had into the strike. Ayaka caught his wrist mid-swing and used his own momentum to throw him across the mat. Frank hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact, and came up snarling like a wounded animal. "That's enough," a voice said from the crowd, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. Everyone turned to see a tall figure in a long coat and wide-brimmed hat stepping out of the shadows near the back wall. His movements were deliberate, controlled, and utterly confident as he approached the demonstration area. Steven Seagal removed his hat slowly, revealing a face that had graced movie screens around the world. The crowd gasped in recognition, cameras swiveling to capture his entrance, but his eyes never left his daughter. "Dad," Ayaka breathed, shocked despite having sensed his presence for weeks. "You did good, kid," Steven said quietly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "But this ends now." Frank struggled to his feet, his face cycling through recognition, fear, and desperate defiance. "This is my dojo," he snarled. "You got no authority here." Steven's smile was cold as winter wind. "Authority? You think I need authority to stop you from hurting my daughter?" He stepped onto the mat with liquid grace, his long coat flowing behind him like a cape. Frank retreated instinctively, but there was nowhere to go. The crowd had formed a tight circle, trapping them both in the center. "You want a demonstration?" Steven continued, beginning to remove his coat. Let me show everyone what happens to people who prey on students. Frank's bravado cracked, revealing the coward beneath. Wait, I never. She's the one who. 14 seconds, Steven said conversationally, folding his coat carefully and setting it aside. That's how long this is going to take. The words were spoken without heat, without anger, but with absolute certainty. Everyone in the room understood they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. Frank threw a desperate combination, right cross, left hook, knee strike, pouring everything he had into one last attempt to salvage his dignity. Steven moved through the attacks like water flowing around stones, each evasion perfectly timed and economically executed. Then he went to work. The first strike was a knife hand to Frank's solar plexus that folded him in half. The second was an elbow to the base of his skull that sent him to his knees. The third was a precisely placed kick to his ribs that lifted him off the ground entirely. By the time Frank hit the mat for the final time, exactly 14 seconds had passed. The room erupted in stunned silence, then whispers, then outright amazement as Frank lay motionless, conscious but completely unable to move. Steven had targeted pressure points with surgical precision, temporarily paralyzing his opponent without causing permanent damage. Class dismissed, Steven said quietly, his voice carrying absolute authority. The crowd began to disperse slowly, parents gathering their children and whispering among themselves about what they'd witnessed. News crews packed their equipment with obvious excitement, already planning their lead stories. But Ayaka remained on the mat, staring at her father with a mixture of gratitude, frustration, and something that might have been love. "You didn't have to do that," she said once they were alone. "Yes, I did." Steven retrieved his coat and hat, preparing to leave, as quietly as he'd arrived. Some people only understand one language. And what language is that? Steven paused at the edge of the mat, his back still turned to her. "Consequence," he said simply. "The language of consequence." As he walked toward the exit, Ayaka called out to him. "Dad." He stopped but didn't turn around. "Thank you." Steven nodded once, pulled his hat low over his eyes, and disappeared into the Detroit night, leaving his daughter to face whatever came next with the knowledge that when it mattered most, he'd been there. On the mat behind them, Frank DeSoto finally managed to sit up, his empire in ruins and his reputation destroyed. But the humiliation in his eyes suggested that this story was far from over. The aftermath came swift and merciless. By morning, videos of the confrontation had gone viral across every social media platform. News outlets were running the story on loop, and Frank DeSoto's name had become synonymous with everything wrong with traditional martial arts culture. The Iron Fist Dojo sat empty, its windows dark and a closed until further notice sign taped to the front door. Police had taken statements from multiple witnesses, Child Protective Services had opened an investigation, and the building's owner had already begun eviction proceedings. Ayaka stood in the East Side Community Center, watching news coverage on her phone while trying to process the surreal reality of her situation. In less than 24 hours, she'd gone from anonymous student to viral sensation to the center of a national conversation about abuse in martial arts schools. "Regrets?" Nina asked, approaching with 2 cups of coffee from the vending machine. "About exposing Frank? Never." Ayaka accepted the coffee gratefully. "About losing my anonymity? That's more complicated." The community center had been transformed overnight. Parents had been calling since dawn, wanting to enroll their children in Ayaka's promised classes. Local news crews had stationed themselves outside, hoping for interviews. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from reporters, documentary filmmakers, and martial arts organizations wanting to capitalize on her story. "The price of being a Seagal," Malik observed, emerging from the storage room where he'd been setting up training equipment. His split lip had healed, but the bruise on his jaw served as a permanent reminder of his confrontation with Frank. "I never wanted to be famous," Ayaka said quietly. "I just wanted to train without the baggage." "Maybe," Nina suggested, "but look what your baggage accomplished." Frank's finished. The authorities are investigating every complaint that was ever filed against him. Kids who were too scared to speak up before are finding their voices. She pulled out her phone and showed Ayaka a news article. Detroit Free Press is running a 3-part series on abuse in martial arts schools. Your story is the catalyst for a much bigger conversation. Ayaka read the headline. hidden in plain sight. How predators use martial arts to exploit students. Below it was a photo of Frank being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of bitter defeat. At least 12 former students have come forward with stories of harassment, intimidation, and assault, she read aloud. The investigation is expected to expand to other schools in the metropolitan area. Your father did more than just beat up a bully, Malik said. He exposed a system that was protecting predators. The mention of Steven made Ayaka's expression grow complicated. She hadn't heard from him since the confrontation, hadn't seen any sign of his continued surveillance. Part of her was grateful for the space, but another part felt abandoned once again. Speaking of your father, Nina said carefully, there's something you should see. She pulled up another news article, this one from a martial arts trade publication. The headline read, Steven Seagal establishes foundation for martial arts, ethics, and student protection. Ayaka's eyes widened as she read. The foundation, funded with a substantial personal donation from Steven, would provide resources for students to report abuse, support for victims of martial arts-related harassment, and training for instructors on ethical teaching practices. He's not just throwing money at the problem, Nina continued, scrolling down to show more details. Look at the board of directors, all women, all martial artists who've dealt with similar issues. And look who's listed as the recommended advisor for curriculum development. At the bottom of the page, Ayaka saw her own name listed as a consulting instructor for the Foundation's youth programs. He didn't ask me about this, she said, her voice mixing surprise with something that might have been pride. Maybe he's learning that support doesn't always require permission, Malik suggested. Before Ayaka could respond, the community center's front door opened and Lena Park entered, followed by 3 other parents. Their faces were serious but determined, the expressions of people who'd made difficult decisions. Ms. Seagal, Lena began formally, then smiled. Actually, Ayaka, if that's okay, we wanted to talk to you about something. The parents arranged themselves in the center of the room, clearly having rehearsed their presentation. Lena, a single mother whose son had been training at Frank's dojo, served as their spokesperson. We've been talking among ourselves since everything came out, she continued. About the warning signs we missed, the red flags we ignored, the times we should have spoken up, but didn't. You couldn't have known, Ayaka started, but Lena held up a hand. We could have known. We did know, some of us. But we told ourselves it was just strict traditional training, that Frank was just old school. Her voice carried the weight of parental guilt. We failed our children by not protecting them. The other parents nodded agreement, their faces reflecting similar regret and determination. So we're forming a parent council. Another parent, James Miller, stepped forward. Not just for this community center, but as a model for other schools. Background checks for all instructors, transparent policies, regular evaluations, and most importantly, student voices that actually get heard. We want you to help us develop the standards, Lena continued. Your experience, both as a victim and as someone with legitimate martial arts credentials, makes you uniquely qualified to help us prevent this from happening elsewhere. Ayaka looked around the room at these parents who'd found the courage to admit their mistakes and work toward solutions. It wasn't the kind of martial arts teaching she'd originally envisioned, but it was something potentially more important. What about the foundation my father established? She asked. We're hoping to work with them. Lena smiled. Combine grassroots, parent advocacy with professional resources and expertise. Create something that actually protects kids instead of just talking about it. Malik moved to stand beside Ayaka, his young face serious but hopeful. I've been thinking about what I want to do after I graduate. Maybe there's a way to combine social work with martial arts instruction. Help kids like me find something positive instead of just surviving. Nina nodded approvingly. And I've got connections in the media world. We can make sure these stories keep getting told, keep the pressure on schools that might be harboring their own Frank DeSotos. Ayaka felt something shift inside her chest, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal achievement or family legacy. This was about building something clean from the ashes of something toxic. Okay, she said quietly. Let's do it. Let's build something better. As the group began planning their next steps, none of them noticed the figure watching through the community center's windows. Steven Seagal stood in the Detroit cold, pride evident in his weathered features as he watched his daughter take the first steps toward becoming the leader he'd always known she could be. But this time, instead of staying in the shadows, he pulled out his phone and sent a simple text. Proud of you. Ready to help when you're ready to ask. Then he walked away, leaving his daughter to build her own legacy in her own way, knowing that the hardest part of being a parent was learning when to step back and let your child become who they were meant to be. 6 weeks after Frank DeSoto's fall, the East Side Community Center had been transformed into something resembling hope made manifest. Fresh mats covered the polished floor, mirrors hung straight and uncracked, and motivational posters proclaimed messages of empowerment rather than intimidation. The space hummed with productive energy as Ayaka moved between small groups of students, offering guidance with the patient precision of someone who'd found her calling. Remember, the goal isn't to hurt anyone, she told a cluster of teenage girls practicing basic self-defense techniques. It's to create space, to give yourself options, to get home safely. Among them was Destiny, the 8-year-old from her original volunteer classes, now 10 and fierce with newfound confidence. The girl who'd once asked what to do when attackers were bigger had become a leader among the younger students, teaching them that size mattered less than smart thinking. Malik worked with a group of boys near the far wall, his own teaching style emerging as something between protective older brother and tactical instructor. At 19, he'd found his path, combining social work studies with martial arts instruction, creating programs for kids aging out of foster care. Control your breathing. He instructed a nervous 13-year-old whose foster placement had given him plenty of reasons to feel unsafe. The technique only works if you stay calm. Panic makes you weak. Nina documented everything from the corner, her laptop surrounded by folders of testimonials, legal documents, and media coverage. Her exposé of Frank had expanded into a comprehensive investigation of abuse in martial arts schools across Michigan. 3 more instructors had been arrested, 2 schools had lost their licenses, and a class action lawsuit was winding its way through the courts. Ayaka, she called out during a break between classes. Channel 7 wants to do a follow-up story. 6 months since the incident. Where are you now? What's next? That kind of thing. Do I have to? Ayaka asked, toweling sweat from her neck. Fame still felt like an ill-fitting jacket she couldn't quite remove. You don't have to do anything, Lena Park interjected, emerging from a parent council meeting in the side room. But you might want to. The story's not about you anymore. It's about what you built. The parent council had grown from 4 determined mothers to a network of advocates spanning 3 states. Their protocols for vetting instructors, protecting students, and maintaining transparency had been adopted by dozens of schools. What started as local damage control had become a national movement. Speaking of what you built, Lena continued, handing Ayaka an official-looking envelope. This came through the foundation's office. Ayaka opened it carefully, her eyes widening as she read. The letter was from the International Association of Martial Arts Schools, offering her a position as Director of Student Safety and Ethics. The salary was modest but steady, the scope was national, and the mission was exactly what she'd been building here on a smaller scale. It's a real job, she said, surprised by the emotion in her voice. A career, not just volunteer work. You sound shocked, Malik observed with a grin. Like you didn't expect anyone to notice what you've been doing here. I expected them to notice my father's name, Ayako admitted. This letter doesn't mention him once. It's about my work, my results, my vision. Nina smiled from behind her laptop. Imagine that. Ayaka Seagal making a name for herself. That evening, as students filtered out and equipment was stored away, Ayaka found herself alone in the transformed space. The silence was different now, not the oppressive quiet of fear, but the peaceful stillness of sanctuary. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw the job offer in the paper. You going to take it? She stared at the message, recognizing the indirect way her father communicated when he didn't want to seem like he was interfering. Somehow, he'd learned about the offer before she decided whether to accept it. Instead of responding immediately, she typed back, "Want to grab coffee and talk about it?" The response came quickly. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., that place on Woodward you used to like as a kid." Ayaka smiled, remembering the little cafe where he'd occasionally taken her after particularly long training sessions. It had been one of the few places where they'd talked about things other than martial arts, her school, her friends, her dreams beyond fighting. Maybe it was time to have that conversation again, as adults who'd both learned something about the difference between strength and wisdom. 1 year later, the East Side Community Center bore a small bronze plaque beside its entrance. Strength is silent. Courage is loud. The words, suggested by Malik and approved unanimously by the parent council, captured something essential about what the space had become, a place where power was measured not by dominance, but by service. Ayaka stood in her small office, reviewing applications from instructors who wanted to join the program. Each candidate underwent background checks, psychological evaluations, and a probationary period where they taught only under supervision. The process was thorough, sometimes to the point of seeming paranoid, but zero tolerance had become the foundation's watchword. Through her window, she could see the afternoon youth class in session. Destiny, now 11 and preparing for her first belt test, was helping a new student practice basic stances. The shy girl who'd once asked about dealing with bigger opponents had become a teacher herself, passing on not just techniques but confidence. Ms. Seagal, a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Maria Santos, 8 years old and barely 3 feet tall, stood in the doorway clutching a piece of paper. "What can I do for you, Maria? I made this for you." Maria approached shyly, offering a drawing rendered in colored pencil. It showed 2 figures on a mat, one large, one small, but the smaller figure was clearly winning. "It's you and the mean coach," Maria explained. "My mom told me about how you stopped him from hurting people." Ayaka knelt to Maria's eye level, studying the drawing carefully. The child had captured something profound, not the violence of the confrontation, but the moment when someone small had refused to stay small. "Thank you," Ayaka said seriously. "This is going on my wall." As Maria skipped back to class, Ayaka found herself thinking about legacy, not the kind that came from famous parents or viral videos, but the kind that lived in the confidence of children who'd learned they didn't have to accept being victims. Her phone buzzed with a text from Nina. "Foundation just got another $50,000 donation. Anonymous, but we both know who." Steven's support had remained largely invisible since that night at the dojo. Financial contributions appeared without fanfare. Connections were made through intermediaries, and his name appeared on no official documents. He'd learned to help without hovering, to contribute without controlling. Their coffee meetings had become monthly rituals, awkward at first, then gradually more comfortable as they learned to relate as adults rather than instructor and student. He never offered unsolicited advice about her work, and she'd stopped seeking his approval for her decisions. It wasn't the relationship either of them had imagined, but it was honest. The afternoon class was ending, students bowing respectfully before collecting their gear and heading home to parents who no longer worried about what happened behind closed doors. The transformation was so complete that it was easy to forget how different things had been just a year ago. Malik emerged from the main training area, now wearing the uniform of a certified instructor and carrying himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd earned his position through service rather than politics. "Good class today," he reported. "Tommy's ready for his green belt test, and I think Maria might be our next natural leader. She reminds me of someone," Ayaka observed with a smile. "Who?" "A scared girl who walked into Frank's dojo pretending to be something she wasn't." Malik's expression grew thoughtful. "You weren't pretending to be weak. You were choosing to be invisible. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yeah. Weak people can't choose to be strong when it matters. You were always strong. You just chose when to show it." As evening approached and the last students departed, Ayaka found herself alone in the space she'd helped transform. The mirrors reflected not broken dreams, but realized possibilities. The mats held the memory of tears that had been followed by growth rather than surrender. A soft knock at the front door interrupted her reflection. Through the glass, she could see a familiar silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, patient. She opened the door to find Steven standing in the Detroit twilight. His expression carefully neutral, but his eyes warm with unmistakable pride. "Thought you might want to see this," he said, holding up a newspaper. The headline read, "Local Program Becomes National Model for Martial Arts Safety." Ayaka accepted the paper, scanning the article that detailed how their small community center had inspired legislation in 6 states and policy changes in hundreds of schools. They interviewed Malik. Steven continued. "Kid gives you all the credit. He's wrong. This was never about one person." "No," Steven agreed. But it started with one person willing to stop hiding. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Father and daughter connected not by shared techniques or family legacy, but by mutual respect for what the other had accomplished. "I should go," Steven said finally. "Just wanted you to know that I'm proud of what you built here." As he turned to leave, Ayaka called out to him. "Dad." He paused, waiting. "Want to help teach the instructor certification class next month?" Not as Steven Seagal the movie star, but as someone who knows what happens when martial arts goes wrong. Steven's smile was quiet but genuine. "I'd like that." He walked away into the Detroit night, leaving his daughter to lock up the space she'd made her own. But this time, his departure felt less like abandonment and more like trust. The recognition that some legacies were earned rather than inherited, and that the strongest foundation was built not on famous names, but on service to others. Inside the community center, the bronze plaque caught the last light of day, its simple message reflecting a truth that had taken a lifetime to understand. Real strength was measured not by what you could destroy, but by what you chose to build. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.